On the 23rd of August 2005, TANS Peru Flight 204 was nearing the end of its journey, a routine domestic flight from Lima to Iquitos with a stop in Pucallpa. But as the Boeing 737-200 advanced began its descent, the skies darkened, and what should have been a simple approach turned into a battle against the elements. Buffeted by severe weather, the pilots made a desperate attempt to bring the plane down safely. But just 4 miles short of the runway, their fight ended in tragedy. What followed was a harrowing scene of survival and loss as 40 of the 98 souls on board perished in the jungle. What caused this catastrophic failure, and could it have been prevented? Stay with us as we unravel the chilling details of TANS Peru Flight 204's final moments. Just an hour ago, this flight was preparing for takeoff from the bustling capital city of Lima. With 91 passengers on board, the aircraft was set to journey to the river town of Pucallpa and then onward to Iquitos, the gateway to the vast Amazon. Taking off from Lima offered a stunning view, a breathtaking scene of snow-capped mountains giving way to the lush green forests of the jungle. Among the passengers was Hector Chapada Ugarte, a government bureaucrat who regularly traveled to Pucallpa for business. He barely made it onto the flight, but there was extra room a few seats down, allowing him to sit more comfortably. As someone who often struggled with cramped spaces on planes, he was relieved to find a seat near the emergency exit where there was more legroom. Today's takeoff was under the control of a former Air Force major, Gonzalo Chirinos Delgado, who was training to become a first officer. His instructor, Captain Octavio Perez Palma, a seasoned former military commander, sat beside him, monitoring the process. Additionally, a highly experienced first officer, Jorge Pinto Panto, was on the jump seat, serving as backup for the trainee. As the plane ascended, Delgado's takeoff was flawless. The 24-year-old Boeing 737 smoothly lifted off into the sky, a textbook performance that earned praise from his instructor. In less than an hour, they expected to arrive in Pucallpa, a place known for its natural beauty and small airport that serves both tourists and business travelers. However, Pucallpa's airport lacked modern weather radar, relying instead on reports from pilots flying nearby. Despite the initial good weather, storm clouds began to loom on the horizon as the plane cruised at 33,000 feet. The crew contacted air traffic control in Pucallpa for landing instructions, but the situation was becoming more uncertain. A storm front was approaching, bringing with it the unpredictable and often dangerous weather systems of the Amazon. As they neared Pucallpa, about 85 kilometers from the airport, the plane encountered severe turbulence. The storm ahead seemed formidable, and passengers began to sense the growing tension. The crew had the option to divert to an alternate airport or return to Lima, but the decision was made to press on. Captain Perez Palma was determined to land at Pucallpa, despite the worsening conditions. Suddenly, the plane started to shake violently from side to side as it descended through the clouds. The altitude was 2,000 feet, and the pilots knew they needed to adhere to their minimum descent altitude. At that time, the minimum descent altitude for this flight was set at 1,500 feet. Captain Perez Palma knew he could not descend any further until he could actually see the runway. It was crucial at this altitude and distance for him to be able to visually confirm the runway to ensure a safe landing. He strained to see any sign of the runway through the dense darkness. Although it was only 2:45 in the afternoon, the sky was so dark it felt as though the windows were shut tight. Despite the challenges, Captain Perez Palma remained focused, knowing the importance of visibility. His trainee seemed nervous as they neared the runway, but Captain Palma decided to take control of the situation. He disengaged the autopilot and manually took charge of the plane. As he did so, hail began to pelt the aircraft, adding to the chaos. Desperately, Captain Palma tried to locate the runway. He knew he was only a few kilometers away, but the visibility was diminishing rapidly. The control tower informed him that they could not authorize a landing until the runway was in sight. With visibility worsening to less than 2.5 kilometers, the situation grew increasingly dire. An altitude alarm suddenly blared, indicating that the plane had inexplicably dropped several hundred feet within seconds. Now it was less than 500 feet from the ground. The crew had only moments to prevent a catastrophe. The pilot's desperate efforts were reflected in his command to move with me, and the urgency in his voice as they fought to regain control and avert disaster. In the midst of this chaotic struggle, the feeling of imminent danger was palpable. The plane had cut a devastating swath through the jungle, scattering debris and leaving behind a trail of destruction. The passengers were in shock as they grappled with the reality of their situation. And a growing cloud of smoke marked the crash site from afar. Local villagers rushed to the scene, some driven by a genuine desire to help, while others were driven by less noble intentions. The scene was a mix of chaos and desperation, as the survivors and responders faced the grim aftermath of the crash. As the initial shock began to settle, the looting at the crash site intensified. Survivors were powerless to intervene, left to sit and wait for help while the chaos unfolded around them. The scene was surreal as a man emerged from the trees, almost as if materializing from the forest itself. This marked the beginning of a frantic recovery operation. Approximately 45 minutes after the crash, rescuers from Pucallpa arrived at the scene. The survivors were in immense pain, and the adrenaline that had initially kept them going was beginning to wear off. Local reporter Gino Marquez Alvarez was among the first journalists to arrive. He was struck by the sight of personal belongings scattered everywhere: suitcases, clothes, and other items belonging to the passengers. This was his first experience covering a plane crash as a journalist, and it left a profound impact on him. Throughout the night, the rescue efforts continued, but it wasn't until morning that the full extent of the disaster became apparent. Out of the 98 people on board, 40 had perished, including all 3 pilots. With no survivors from the cockpit, the final moments of Flight 204 remained a mystery. This crash was the 5th fatal incident involving TANS Peru in just 13 years. TANS Peru, established by the government in 1962, had earned a reputation for having one of the worst safety records in South America. Just 2.5 years earlier, another TANS Peru flight had ended in disaster when all 46 people aboard died during a failed descent from Chiclayo to Chachaboyas. The crash occurred only minutes before landing when the plane struck a hill. The tragic events attracted significant public attention, and the search for answers became a pressing demand. Why did the accident happen? The responsibility to uncover the truth fell to the team from Peru's Aviation Accident Investigation Commission, led by Patrick Frickberg. Frickberg's first encounter with the crash site was overwhelming. The smell of fuel and blood was pervasive, and the wreckage was still burning 24 hours after the crash. The sight of the devastated scene, with fragments of the aircraft scattered around, was both shocking and surprising, especially given that some had survived the impact. The looting of the wreckage was particularly distressing. Frickberg observed people taking anything they could carry: tires, oxygen bottles, metal pieces, and parts of the landing gear. The motives behind the looting ranged from immediate need to the potential for financial gain. With a small contingent of government soldiers present, Frickberg struggled to preserve crucial evidence. He emphasized the need to guard important components, such as the engines, around the clock, without exception. The challenge was enormous, and the scale of the disaster made it difficult to control the situation effectively. Frickberg's team focused on documenting the wreckage, taking photos of everything before it was lost or stolen. They prioritized recovering critical flight data from the black boxes, which were essential for understanding what happened in the final moments of the flight. As the investigation continued, other survivors were interviewed. Their accounts confirmed the reports of a severe hailstorm that struck just before Flight 204 went down. This raised concerns about whether the hail had somehow contributed to the crash by damaging the engines or other critical systems. The potential for severe hailstorms to cause such damage was evident, as demonstrated by previous incidents involving aircraft encountering similar weather conditions. Frickberg reflected on the dangers of flying through a hailstorm, noting that it could be incredibly hazardous for an aircraft. The challenges faced by the investigators were immense, and every piece of information was crucial in piecing together the puzzle of what went wrong on that fateful day. As investigators continued their probing into Flight 204's tragic fate, the lead they'd hoped for seemed elusive. Initial theories pointed to the storm's ferocity, intense rain and hail that might have triggered a dual flameout in the engines. This would be akin to a candle's flame being extinguished by a sudden gust of wind. Such speculation drew attention to whether Flight 204 had experienced a similar catastrophic engine failure. The engines, despite suffering considerable damage to their outer casings, revealed a more telling story during inspection. While the turbines themselves remained largely intact, a deeper look uncovered plant debris lodged inside them. This crucial find indicated that the engines were still operational when the plane collided with the jungle canopy. This observation helped rule out the possibility of an engine flameout as the cause of the crash. However, the exact reason for the accident remained a mystery. The discovery of one of the black boxes, specifically the cockpit voice recorder, brought a glimmer of hope. With Peru lacking the technology to analyze it, the recorder was quickly shipped to the NTSP in Washington for examination. The anticipation of valuable insights from the black box was palpable. Yet, the second black box, the flight data recorder, was still missing. There were growing concerns that looters might have stolen it from the wreckage site, which was further compounded by the frustration of losing control over the crash site. In an effort to retrieve the crucial flight data recorder, authorities posted a $500 reward, hoping it would encourage the return of the missing piece of evidence. This recorder was vital as it held data on engine performance and aircraft systems up until the moment of impact. Without it, understanding the precise circumstances leading up to the crash was challenging. As the search continued, Frickberg focused on gathering information from the Pucallpa Tower controller, who had been monitoring Flight 204. The controller had reported the presence of dangerous cumulonimbus clouds, notorious in aviation for their hazardous conditions. Known colloquially as Charlie Bravo clouds, these storm clouds were recognized as severe threats, capable of causing significant turbulence and other flight risks. The tower controller's role was limited. While he could warn of adverse weather conditions, he did not have the authority to close the airport. He had advised the crew of deteriorating conditions and recommended either avoiding the storm or climbing to a higher altitude. According to standard visual flight rules, pilots facing zero visibility should gain altitude immediately and seek an alternate airport. The investigation now faced the crucial question: why did Captain Perez Palma choose to fly directly into the storm? Despite having enough fuel to divert to another airport, the decision to proceed into the tempest seemed perplexing. Suspicions arose about whether the airline's origins and its military roots influenced this decision. Task Peru, initially a military operator without certification from civil aviation authorities, employed personnel who were primarily military pilots. Their training and operational mindset often differed from those of civilian pilots, who have more autonomy in questioning orders and making safety-related decisions. The military's ingrained ethos of mission completion posed a pressing question. Did Perez Palma's military background lead him to prioritize the mission over the safety of his passengers? This ongoing investigation aimed to unravel whether this potentially dangerous approach contributed to the devastating outcome of Flight 204. As Frickberg delves deeper into the investigation, he heads to Washington, where NTSB specialists have the capability to extract the crucial data from the cockpit voice recorder, CVR. He listens intently to the recordings, but his concern grows as he hears only 2 voices instead of the expected 3. The absence of the first officer's voice raises questions. Where could he be? The lack of the first officer's input becomes a critical piece of the puzzle. Frickberg's frustrations are compounded when he receives a call from his Lima office with an update. The reward for the second black box has had its intended effect. A local in Pucallpa has agreed to exchange the flight data recorder, FDR, for the promised $500. This breakthrough could provide answers, but it hinges on whether the FDR is still functional. If it works, it could reveal essential details about any in-flight mechanical or electrical failures that led to the crash. However, the joy of recovering the FDR is short-lived. Upon inspection, it's clear that the recorder has been tampered with. The device is badly burned, and its intricate internal mechanisms have been damaged. The tape inside is destroyed, rendering it useless. This development is a bitter disappointment for the investigators who had hoped the FDR would provide critical insights. Adding to their woes, Pucallpa Airport lacks radar capabilities, unlike Lima Airport, which does. Without radar data from Pucallpa, investigators are missing crucial information on the aircraft's rate of descent. This data would have been invaluable in understanding how rapidly the situation deteriorated. Frickberg is left with no choice but to get creative. He meticulously listens to the pilots' descriptions of their position and reconstructs the aircraft's flight path through detailed analysis. By measuring the time it took for the plane to travel certain distances and calculating its airspeed, he deduces the rate of descent. His calculations reveal a startling detail. 34 seconds before impact, the plane plummeted, losing 1,000 feet in altitude rapidly. This was followed by an erratic maneuver, which, instead of correcting the descent, led the plane into a free fall. The findings paint a harrowing picture of Flight 204's final moments. The aircraft's sudden altitude loss, coupled with a rapid decrease in speed, underscores the gravity of the situation. As the aircraft plunged from 600 knots to just 313 knots in a mere 38 seconds, the turbulence in the sky intensified. The sudden drop in speed and altitude aligned perfectly with the onset of the hailstorm. Inside the cockpit, Frickberg, already certain that the hailstorm wasn't the direct cause of the engines flaming out, began to suspect it might have been responsible for a different but equally critical issue. To investigate further, he examined high-resolution satellite imagery of the thundercloud at the time of the crash. The storm cell appeared enormous, and the size of the hailstones was striking. Frickberg's analysis revealed a particularly dangerous feature, a hail shaft. This phenomenon consists of a rapidly descending column of air known as a downdraft. Encountering such a downdraft could be disastrous, either by directly damaging the aircraft or by forcefully pushing it downward. Historical data supported this danger. In 1985, a Lockheed L-1011, while descending into Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, had been struck by a severe downdraft, crashing just short of the runway. Could a similar downdraft have been responsible for Flight 204's drastic loss of speed and altitude? Experienced pilots like Perez Palma, with extensive training and practice, should have been able to manage the effects of a downdraft. They would normally push the controls forward to gain speed, then pull back to climb and apply full engine power to regain altitude. This well-practiced maneuver should have kept the plane from descending uncontrollably. Yet, something went wrong. Investigators now face two critical questions. Why couldn't the pilots recover from the downdraft, and why didn't they realize they were losing altitude until the alarm sounded? The crew's failure to notice their rapid descent was puzzling. Typically, one crew member focuses on flight instruments while the other monitors external conditions. However, in this case, the captain, despite being a highly experienced fighter pilot with numerous flight hours, seemed to be caught off guard. Perez Palmer, a decorated war hero with deep familiarity with this route and unpredictable weather, appeared to be the ideal pilot for this scenario. Yet the situation was incomprehensible. As Frickberg reviewed photographs from the crash site, he discovered a crucial clue. A section of the plane's windshield was frosted and opaque. This frostiness, he learned, resulted from large hail cracking the windshield's outer layers. Such damage created a frosted texture that obstructed the crew's view, rendering them unable to see the runway or assess their descent visually. As the aircraft was pushed down by the downdraft, the crew's visibility was compromised. Unable to see the runway, they relied solely on their instruments, which were also failing them. The altitude alert system began to blare, but it was too late. Commercial jetliners are equipped with a ground proximity radar system that triggers warnings if the plane descends too low without deploying landing gear. Despite their attempts to pull up, the plane did not climb, leaving investigators to unravel why the aircraft failed to respond as expected. As the engines roared at maximum power, a moment of tense confusion enveloped the cockpit. Each sound was scrutinized and eliminated, the pilots and investigators alike trying to piece together what went wrong. The cacophony of noise was nothing but a barrage of engines, yet something was off. The engines, which should have been screaming as they revved up, remained eerily silent. Instead, the cockpit was filled with a constant, unchanging hum. Despite the pilots' attempts to climb out of the dire situation, the engines did not spool up as expected. The crew's failure to perform a critical standard procedure, accelerating out of trouble, sealed their fate. Investigator Freakberg found himself grappling with how such a fundamental error could have occurred. He meticulously reviewed the chain of events leading up to the crash, piecing together a perfect storm of unlikely occurrences and tragic mistakes. It was as if time slowed down when the scene inside the cockpit began to unravel. The first officer, ensnared by a broken seatbelt, found himself in a precarious position. The captain, Captain Perez Palmer, had made a critical misjudgment. He had flown straight into the heart of the storm, believing he could navigate through it. Intense hail shattered the windshield, rendering visibility nearly impossible. Amidst the chaos, the ground proximity alarm blared, but it was too late. The pilot's failure to respond appropriately, to throttle up in a critical moment, had dire consequences. Freakberg's investigation revealed that the fatal error stemmed from a single critical decision made moments before the crash. Captain Perez Palmer's loss of confidence in his co-pilot led him to take control at a crucial time, but this switch left the crew scrambling. In the final moments, as the pilots struggled with the transition of roles, confusion reigned. The new pilot in command, now captain, grappled with the demands of flying while his co-pilot was overwhelmed. Both were distracted, neither fully attentive to the instruments nor the rapidly descending aircraft. They pulled back on the controls, both believing the other would push the throttles forward to maximum thrust. This lapse in discipline, this fatal oversight, was not an isolated incident. Investigators would later discover that similar issues had plagued previous accidents. Despite recommendations from an earlier crash, the same mistakes were repeated. The tragic pattern of failing to adhere to visual flight rules continued. The investigation would ultimately reveal that the airline's broader issues contributed to the crash. An impending mid-air collision with a commercial airline pushed the Peruvian government to act decisively. TANS Peru Airline was closed down less than a year after the crash. The official report laid bare the stark reality. The major cause of the accident was pilot error, driven by a severe loss of situational awareness. The violation of procedures was not just a contributing factor, it was the root cause. As we bring this harrowing story to a close, we're reminded of the fragility of life and the immense responsibility carried by those in the skies. The tragedy of TANS Peru Flight 204 serves as a stark reminder of the unpredictable forces pilots face and the critical importance of safety in aviation. Thank you for joining us in exploring this difficult chapter in aviation history. Your thoughts and feedback are invaluable, so please share your insights and let us know how we can continue to improve. We appreciate your support, and we hope to see you in the next video. Stay safe and take care.